The glow of a smartphone screen flared in the half-darkness of the tent, blinding me for a split second. The vibration shattered the graveyard silence like a gunshot. My heart skipped, then began pounding somewhere up in my throat. My fingers, trembling, slick with cold sweat, reached for the phone lying on the sleeping bag. There was a single new notification on the screen. A message. I read it, and the blood drained from my face, turning my legs to rubber. Run. It's already after you. I looked up at my friends, but I didn't have time to say a word. Outside, right next to the thin fabric of the tent, a branch snapped. A heavy, wet crack beneath the weight of something enormous. What happened that day on the Appalachian Trail wasn't an encounter with a bear or drunk locals. It was a collision with something that should not exist in our rational world. I don't go hiking anymore. I sold all my gear, including the backpack I loved most, and even moved to a city where no trees grow taller than 2 stories. I'm telling this story only once, as a warning. If you find something in the forest that seems perfect, run. There are no witnesses in the woods. We were experienced hikers. Me, Mark, and Sarah. We'd completed half of the Pacific Crest Trail and countless routes in Colorado, so the Appalachians felt like an easy stroll. We were wrong. The Appalachians are old mountains. Ancient. The forest feels different here, denser, darker, and, how do I put it, as if it's watching you. It was the 3rd day of our 5-day trek through a particularly remote section in Tennessee. The weather had turned sour early that morning. Low, leaden clouds smothered the sky, turning the day into endless twilight. The air was heavy and damp, smelling of rotting leaves and wet earth. We fell behind schedule. Recent rains had washed out sections of the trail, and every step was a struggle. Mud clung to our boots, adding what felt like a kilogram to each foot. By 5 in the evening, we were exhausted. Dusk deepened faster than usual beneath the thick canopy. We were looking for a place to camp, but the slopes were too steep and the lowlands too swampy. Over there, look! Sarah's voice cut through the monotonous rush of wind in the treetops. She pointed off to the right, away from the main trail, with her trekking pole. Through the dense undergrowth, we saw a clearing. We left the trail, pushing through rhododendron bushes that clawed at our clothes like bony fingers. When we stepped into the clearing, we froze. It was a perfect campsite. Too perfect. A flat patch of ground surrounded by old oaks that shielded it from the wind. But most importantly, it was already occupied. 2 expensive bright orange tents, a rain tarp stretched taut above them, and neatly stacked logs around a fire pit. "Hey!" Mark shouted, pulling back his hood. "Anyone here?" Silence. Not the kind where people have simply gone quiet after hearing someone approach. This was a padded, absolute silence. No birds. No crickets. No wind. Just our own breathing. Maybe they went to get water? I suggested, though even then a quiet voice inside me whispered that something was wrong. The nearest stream was 2 kilometers back. We moved closer. We didn't want to intrude, but curiosity and a strange unease pulled us forward. The first thing that caught my eye was the fire. It wasn't burning, but a thin ribbon of bluish smoke still rose from the embers. I held my hand over the pit. Warm. The heat was unmistakable. Someone had fed the fire no more than 15 or 20 minutes ago. "Guys," Sarah called. She was standing by a folding table under the tarp. "Look at this." 3 bowls sat on the table. Oatmeal with berries. Spoons lay neatly beside them on napkins. The food was steaming. Vapor rose from the porridge and vanished into the cold air. I touched the rim of one bowl. "Hot." "They just left," Mark whispered, scanning the trees. "Like, just now." We stood in the middle of someone else's camp, surrounded by strangers' belongings, feeling like thieves. But logic refused to cooperate. If they'd heard us and decided to hide, why abandon hot food? If they'd stepped away to use the bathroom, why all three at once, and long enough for the oatmeal to cool, but not quite? Maybe we should leave, Sarah said, her voice unsteady. This feels wrong. Like we broke into someone's house. I should have listened to her. I should have said, yes, let's go, pitch a tent in a swamp if we have to, anywhere but here. But I was tired, hungry, and rational. Let's wait for them, I said, dropping my heavy pack. They couldn't have gone far. Their gear's here. Maybe someone got hurt and they're helping each other. If so, they might need help. That was my decision. And it was my mistake. We sat on the logs by their fire. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The forest around us darkened, fading from gray to black. No one returned. The silence became physically painful. It felt as though the trees had crept closer, closing a ring around the clearing. I began noticing details I'd missed at first. The backpacks near the tents were open. Not torn open in panic, but carefully unzipped. Inside, though, there was chaos. Clothes were overturned, as if someone had been searching frantically, yet trying to do it quietly. I'm going to check the tents, Mark said, standing up. No, Sarah protested. That's private property. Sarah, no one's been back for half an hour, and their food's still on the table. What if someone's inside? Unconscious? Mark walked to the larger tent and slowly unzipped it. The sound, zzzip, was deafeningly loud. He peered inside and froze. Come here, he said softly, tension in his voice. I stepped closer. The tent was clean, but strangely empty. The sleeping bags were laid out, but crumpled, as if someone had scrambled out of them in a hurry. In the center lay a large, expensive power bank. 2 iPhones and a smartwatch were plugged into it. Green indicators blinked. Charging. Who leaves their phones behind when they go into the woods? Mark asked. No one hikes without a phone anymore. Navigation, photos, emergency calls. I climbed inside, feeling like a grave robber. The air was stale. It didn't just smell of sweat, it smelled of fear. You know that smell? Sharp, acidic, the scent of adrenaline released in moments of terror. I picked up one of the phones. It was locked, but the lock screen showed the time and a wallpaper, a smiling couple, a man and a woman, standing on a mountain summit. They looked happy. The same people whose oatmeal was cooling outside. There's no sign of a struggle, I said, forcing calm into my voice. No blood. No torn fabric. Look at this, Sarah said from the tent entrance, staring at the ground. She pointed to the mud just outside. I crawled out and shone my flashlight. Dusk had nearly turned to night. Footprints were pressed into the soft, wet soil. Boot prints, but strange ones. Deep impressions at the toes, barely visible heels. They were running, Sarah said. They burst out of the tents and bolted straight into the forest. Where? Mark asked. Sarah swept her beam toward the dense brush opposite the direction we'd come from. Into the thicket. No trail. A chill ran down my spine. 3 people abandoning food, phones, and gear, barefoot or in unlaced boots, judging by the smeared edges of the prints, charging into impenetrable forest. Why? A bear? If it were a bear, the camp would be destroyed, the food eaten. But the food was untouched. We need to get out of here, Mark said sharply. Now. And that was when we heard it. The sound. It came from the direction the tracks led. It sounded like a sob. Or a muffled moan. Very quiet, barely audible. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Help, a faint voice. Female. Weak, trembling. Logic screamed, run. Instinct howled, leave. But humanity, damn humanity, made us stop. Someone's hurt, I said. They ran, someone fell. We switched on our powerful headlamps. Beams cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks like columns in a ruined temple. We're coming. I shouted into the dark. Where are you? No answer. Just that soft, pitiful sound again, like crying. It was about 50 meters in, deep in the brush. We moved toward it. We walked in a line, Mark on the left, me in the center, Sarah on the right. Every step on wet leaves sounded like an explosion. We passed beyond the camp and into the forest. The tracks grew more chaotic. Someone had fallen here, a long smear in the mud. Here, someone had crawled on all fours. Guys, Sarah said in a shaking voice. Look at the tree. She shone her light on an old beech. About 2 meters up, the bark had been stripped away. Fresh, pale wounds in the wood. Not bare claws. Fingernails. Human fingernails. Had someone tried to climb the tree? Or been dragged upward? A scrap of fabric was snagged in the bark. Bright blue fleece. I looked down. Beneath the tree lay another object. A second phone. Face down in the mud. I picked it up. The glass was cracked, but the screen still worked. I pressed the power button. Battery, 4%. A video was paused. The phone must have fallen while recording. What is it? Mark asked, close enough that I felt his breath. I hit play. The video had been recorded about an hour earlier. The camera shook. First, the man's face filled the screen. He whispered, "It won't leave. It's standing right behind the tent." The camera turned toward the tent wall. The fabric bowed inward. Something outside slowly dragged something sharp across it. The sound of synthetic material scraping. Then the woman's voice, off camera, it's imitating Marcus. I hear Marcus's voice outside, but Marcus is here, next to me. The camera jerked. Panic. They tore open the tent. The image blurred as they ran. The phone fell. The last frames showed sky and treetops. And then the sound. The sound that nearly made me drop the phone. On the recording, after the phone hit the ground, heavy footsteps approached. And then a voice. My voice. On the video, the creature spoke in my voice, with my intonation, "We're coming." Where are you? I froze. The cold I felt didn't come from the wind. It came from inside. The recording was made an hour ago. But my voice on it sounded exactly like I had shouted just a minute earlier. That's impossible," Mark whispered. It knew we were coming, Sarah whimpered. It knew what we'd say. And then we understood. The crying we'd heard, it wasn't an injured woman. It was bait. The sound stopped the moment we found the phone. We stood in the dark, 50 meters from the safety of the campfire light, which we, idiots, hadn't even stoked, surrounded by a forest that was listening. "Back," I mouthed. Slowly. Back to the camp. We began retreating. We didn't turn our backs on the forest. Our flashlight beams swept the bushes, catching shadows that seemed to move whenever the light shifted. Crunch. To the right. Very close. Sarah, to me. I barked. We huddled together. Something was moving around us. It wasn't hiding. It was circling. We heard footsteps, heavy, bipedal, but the rhythm was wrong. Too fast. Jerky. We reached the clearing with the tents. The perfect camp now felt like a tomb. "Grab our packs and run for the trail," Mark ordered. "No. Sarah shouted. "We won't make it to the trail in the dark, we'll break our legs. We need to stay here, build the fire as high as possible. Animals fear fire. It's not an animal," I yelled, losing control. We rushed into the center of the camp. I lunged for the fire pit, trying to coax the embers back to life. Mark grabbed a gas stove. Sarah frantically searched for a knife. And then I remembered. The phone in the tent. The first one, still charging. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I hoped to call 911, even though there was no signal. I dove into the main tent. It was just as empty and terrifying. I grabbed the iPhone. At that moment, it vibrated. The screen lit up. The message hadn't come through cellular service, there was none, but via Bluetooth, AirDrop, or some local messenger. I don't understand it. Or maybe I was losing my mind. But the text was clear. "Run. It's already after you." I looked up. Through the translucent mesh of the tent entrance, I saw Sarah's back. She was standing by the fire. And behind her, at the edge of light and darkness, stood something. It was tall. Pale, like the belly of a dead fish. Its limbs were grotesquely long, hanging almost to the ground. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it was dressed. It wore a torn, filthy Columbia jacket. The same jacket I'd seen in the photo on the phone's lock screen. It had no face. Where eyes and a mouth should have been, there was smooth, wet skin. But it made sounds. It spoke in Sarah's voice. "Look at this," the creature said, perfectly mimicking her tone from half an hour earlier. The real Sarah screamed. I burst out of the tent through the opposite side, slashing the fabric with a knife that was suddenly in my hand. "Run!" I screamed. We didn't take our packs. We took nothing but our flashlights. We tore through the brush, blind to direction. Branches whipped our faces, tearing skin to blood. I heard Mark fall, curse, scramble up, and keep running. Sarah sobbed as she ran. Behind us, the camp came alive. Not with growls, but with a cacophony of voices. Laughter. Snippets of phrases. "Hey, anyone here? Over there, look. Oatmeal with berries." The creature replayed all our conversations from the past hour, mixing them into a mad, glitching remix. And the noise was getting closer. It was running through the forest, snapping young trees like matchsticks. We ran until our lungs burned and our mouths tasted of metal. We burst out onto an old logging road. "Light!" Mark gasped. "There's light." Headlights flickered through the trees. A road. A real road. We forced ourselves faster, though it felt like we had nothing left. The sounds of pursuit behind us stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. The forest fell dead silent again. But we didn't stop. We stumbled onto the asphalt directly in front of a passing pickup. The driver slammed the brakes, the truck skidded. A man jumped out with a tire iron, thinking it was an attack, but when he saw our faces, pale and bloodied, eyes wild, he understood immediately. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Get in the bed. Now." As we rode away in the back of the pickup, I looked into the darkness of the forest. There was no one at the roadside where we'd emerged. But when the truck turned, the headlights swept the trees for a second. I swear I saw a silhouette. It stood at the forest's edge. And it was waving. The same gesture people use to see friends off. We made it to town. We reported a missing group to the rangers. They organized a search the next morning. They found the camp. The tents were still there, but shredded to pieces. All electronics were gone. The food, they said the bowls were filled with rot and maggots, as if they'd been sitting there for weeks, not hours. They never found any trace of those people. No bodies. No belongings. No pale creature. The official version is that they got lost and wandered deep into the forest. The case remains open. But I know the truth. Sometimes, at night, when my apartment is too quiet, I think I hear my own voice from the hallway. It asks, "Anyone here?" And I pray it's just a hallucination. But just in case, I never answer. Sometimes the forest seems empty, but that is a lie. It is never empty. Have you ever felt someone watching you in a place where there is absolutely no one? That moment when the hairs on the back of your neck rise and your instincts scream, "Run"? Most people ignore that feeling. They blame it on nerves, fatigue, or tricks of the light. I did the same. Until that day in the Appalachian Mountains. What happened to me on that stretch of the trail defies logic, but the scars on my arms and my paralyzing fear of the dark are very real. This is not a campfire story. This is a warning. If you see an old, leaning shelter that does not appear on any map, do not stop. And for God's sake, do not read the logbook. Welcome to the channel. Get comfortable. Turn off the lights. And listen carefully. I always considered myself an experienced hiker. The Appalachian Trail was my dream, my challenge. I planned to cross a difficult section in Tennessee in 4 days. But the mountains do not forgive arrogance. By the middle of the second day, the weather turned. The sky, gray in the morning, grew heavy and leaden by noon. The air became thick and wet, smelling of soaked earth and rotting leaves. I was falling behind schedule. My leg began to ache after a bad descent over loose rocks, and my planned campsite was still 8 miles away. In those conditions, that meant at least 4 more hours of hiking, and darkness comes fast in the mountains. The rain started without warning. A freezing, slanted downpour that cut straight through my jacket. Visibility dropped to nothing. I walked staring at the ground, careful not to slip on wet roots. That was why I almost ran straight into it. The shelter emerged from the fog like a ghost. It made no sense. My laminated, detailed map showed no shelters in that sector. Appalachian Trail shelters are usually simple 3-sided lean-tos with a wooden floor where hikers roll out their sleeping bags. This one looked old. The logs were gray with age, covered in moss, the roof sagging in places. But it had a roof. And walls. That was enough. I dropped my heavy pack onto the dry planks of the floor. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic, like old copper. I was too exhausted to analyze smells. I pulled off my soaked boots, wrung out my socks, and set up my stove to boil water. While the water heated, I noticed a metal box on a shelf in the corner. Shelters usually keep a logbook there, a notebook where hikers leave notes. Some write poetry, some complain about blisters, some mark where they found water. It's a kind of social network of the woods. I opened the box. The notebook inside was old, its cover swollen from moisture. I flipped to a random page. Entry dated May 14th. We arrived late. The rain hasn't stopped. The place is creepy, but dry. Mike says he hears footsteps behind the back wall. I turned the page. May 15th, different handwriting, more jagged. Do not sleep here. We left at 3 a.m. It doesn't like being watched. But it hates it even more when you close your eyes. I frowned. Typical hiker scare stories. People love to frighten each other. I kept flipping. June. I thought it was a deer. It was not a deer. Leave while it's light. July. Why is it so quiet here? Where are the birds? We're leaving. To hell with the rain. August. It stood at the edge of the clearing for 3 hours. Just stood there. Do not stay overnight. Do not stay overnight. Do not stay overnight. The last line was written with such force that the paper had torn. I closed the notebook and looked around. The shelter was empty. The forest roared under the rain, but it was a flat, monotonous sound of water. There really were no birds. No squirrels. No rustling in the brush. Only rain. I checked my watch. 6:45 p.m. Less than an hour until sunset. Continuing in that downpour, with an injured leg, in the dark, would be suicide. I convinced myself the entries were just a local prank. One joker started it, the rest played along. I decided to stay. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Dusk in the forest does not arrive the way it does in the city. In the city, light fades gradually. In the forest, darkness rises from the ground, from the ravines, filling the space between the trees until it swallows everything. I rolled out my sleeping bag, hung my headlamp from a beam, and tried to eat. I couldn't swallow. I felt like I was on a stage. A shelter has no front wall. You are exposed to the forest. You sit in a lit box, and in front of you is a black wall of trees. You can't see them, but they see you perfectly. Around 8, the rain stopped. And then the silence came. It wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. No wind. No dripping leaves. No insects. Absolute, dead stillness. I sat hugging my knees, staring into the darkness. My headlamp illuminated only the first row of trees. Beyond that, nothing. Then I heard it. The sound was soft and wet. Slap, slap, slap. As if someone were walking barefoot through mud. Slow. Rhythmic. I snapped off my headlamp. Darkness hit my eyes. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid it would give me away. Logic said that if someone was out there, they had already seen my light. But instinct screamed, hide. The footsteps came closer. They weren't coming from the trail. They came from the brush, from where there were no paths. The sound stopped about 10 meters from the shelter. I held my breath and listened. A minute. 2. 5. Nothing. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe water dripping from the roof. I slowly reached into my pack and found my knife. It helped, a little. I switched the light back on and aimed it where the footsteps had stopped. The beam cut through the darkness. Wet tree trunks. Ferns. Empty space. No one there. I exhaled, hands shaking. Calm down, I whispered to myself. It's just a bear or a deer. It got scared by the light and ran. But animals don't stand silently. Animals break branches, snort. There had been only silence. I decided I wouldn't sleep. I would sit with the knife and the light until dawn. I pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. The screen read 10:15 p.m. Time crawled. To distract myself, I picked up the logbook again. I wanted a rational explanation. Maybe someone had described exactly what they saw. I flipped to the last pages. The final entry was from just 2 days earlier. The handwriting was uneven, the letters shaking. It doesn't come in while you're watching. But there are more of them now. First 1. Then 3. They copy sounds. If you hear someone calling for help, don't answer. It's a trap. I slammed the notebook shut. At that exact moment, a voice came from the forest. Hey! Is anyone there? It was a male voice, hoarse, slightly muffled. It came from the right, maybe 20 meters away. My breath caught. A person. A normal hiker, lost too. Thank God. I opened my mouth to shout, over here. When the entry flashed in my mind. They copy sounds. I froze. Something about the voice was wrong. It was too even. No fear. No hope. Just sound. Help me, I hurt my leg, the voice continued. Same tone. Same rhythm. Then, from the left side of the shelter, another voice answered. My voice. Who's there? It was exactly what I had wanted to shout a minute earlier, but hadn't. The blood drained from my face. I sat in the center of that wooden box, gripping my knife, while voices came from the darkness on all sides. Hey! From the right. Who's there? From the left. Help me, straight ahead, just beyond the edge of the light. I understood why no one slept in that shelter. I turned off the light. I realized the light made me a target. I crawled into the farthest corner of the shelter, pressing my back against the logs. My eyes slowly adjusted. The sky had cleared a little, and weak moonlight filtered through the canopy. The forest turned gray, filled with shadows. The voices stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Now I heard only my breathing and the wild pounding of my heart. I stared at the open front of the shelter. A rectangle of slightly lighter gray against black walls. And then I saw movement. At the edge of the clearing, where the trees began, a shadow separated itself. It was tall. Too tall for a human. And unnaturally thin. The figure stepped onto the clearing. Its movements were jerky, like in an old film. It stopped. Then, from the other side, another figure emerged. Shorter. Hunched. They did not approach the shelter. They just stood at the forest line and looked in. I couldn't see faces, only silhouettes. But I felt their attention. It was physical, like pressure underwater. I remembered the entry, it doesn't come in while you're watching. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, they were closer. Only a couple of meters. But closer. My God. They move only when I'm not looking. I forced my eyes wide, trying not to blink. Tears welled from the strain. The figures stood motionless, like statues. Their arms hung at their sides, unnaturally long. My eyelids grew heavy. My body demanded a blink. I blinked. Fast. A fraction of a second. A rustle. A step on dry grass. They were closer again. Now I could see details. They were naked. Their skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over bone. No hair. But the worst part was the faces. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark hollows. And the mouths, their mouths were open in impossibly wide, frozen shapes. Not smiles. Just stretched skin. There were 4 of them now, standing in a semicircle before the shelter. About 10 meters away. I knew I couldn't last long. I couldn't keep my eyes open forever. Without looking away, I groped through my pack and found my powerful handheld spotlight. If they fear light, or at least react to it, I had to run. But where? Into the forest, where there might be more? Staying meant death. The moment I blinked for more than a second, they would be on the platform. I rose slowly to my feet, not blinking. The pain in my leg vanished under adrenaline. I gripped the light in my left hand, the knife in my right. Get away from me. I screamed, my voice breaking into a shriek. They didn't move. I squeezed my eyes shut for 1 second. Slap. Slap. The wet sound of feet on wood. I snapped my eyes open and blasted the spotlight at full power. The nearest thing was already on the first step of the shelter. A hand with long, filthy fingers reached for the post. The beam hit its face. I saw it clearly. A lipless mouth full of small, needle-like teeth. The creature made a sound, a hiss turning into a grinding screech. It covered its face and recoiled into the darkness. The others jerked back too. The light hurt them. That was my chance. I didn't grab my gear. I left the tent, the sleeping bag, the stove. I jumped off the platform straight into the mud, dashed past the writhing figure, and ran. I have never run so fast in my life. I didn't follow the trail. I crashed through brush, branches whipping my face, tearing my skin. I fell, got up, and ran again. The beam of my light danced wildly, snatching fragments of forest. Behind me, I heard pursuit. Not footsteps of running people. The crash of breaking brush and that sound again, many voices repeating my own curses and gasps. "Damn it! Damn it!" echoed from the woods in my own distorted voice. I knew if I stopped, I was dead. I ran downhill, risking a broken neck. Then the forest opened. I burst onto a gravel road. It wasn't a main road, just a logging track, but it was wide and open. I didn't stop. I ran another mile until my lungs burned. Only when I saw the lights of a distant farm did I dare to turn around. The forest stood behind me like a wall. Dark. Motionless. At the tree line, where moonlight fell across the road, there was no one. But I knew they were there. Watching. Waiting for the light to go out. I reached the farm. Dogs started barking. The owner came out with a shotgun. I must have looked insane, covered in mud and blood, knife in hand. But he let me onto the porch and gave me a phone. The rangers found the shelter 2 days later. They said it was empty. My gear wasn't there. No pack. No sleeping bag. Nothing. But the strangest thing was this: they said there were no official shelters in that sector. It was an old logging structure, abandoned in the 1970s after a crew of workers disappeared. They found the logbook. The ranger who returned my documents, I'd lost them during the escape, but for some reason they were neatly stacked on the shelter floor, asked me something strange. "Son, why did you fill the entire notebook with the same sentence?" I stared at him. I didn't write anything. I only read it. He showed me a photo of the page. The entire page, top to bottom, was covered in my handwriting. "He doesn't sleep. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't sleep." And the last entry, at the very bottom, written in fresh ink. "He left. But we'll wait for the next one. I don't hike anymore. I sleep only with the lights on. And I got a dog. Because sometimes, at night, when it's raining, I hear the soft, wet sound of footsteps beneath my window. And a voice. My own voice, whispering from the darkness. Open up. I want to sleep." The sound of a zipper on the tent. Slow, uneven, the teeth separating one by one. Zzz. I lay there with my hand clamped over my mouth, afraid to even breathe. Outside was the impenetrable darkness of the Appalachian forests, and only inches of thin nylon stood between me and whatever was out there. I could smell him. Not the smell of sweat or dirt common to hikers. He smelled of old, stale tobacco and something sweetish, like rotting leaves. "I know you're not sleeping, Artyom," a voice whispered right by my head, through the fabric. "You never did answer me about Anna." My heart skipped a beat. Anna had died 3 years ago. No one on that godforsaken trail knew that. No one. The zipper crept down another couple of centimeters. Many people think the Appalachian Trail is a place of communion with nature, campfire romance, and a friendly hiker community. For the most part, that's true. But people forget that it's 2,000 miles of wilderness where it's easy to disappear, and even easier to meet someone who does not want to be found. This happened last October. I'm not paranoid, and I don't believe in ghosts. But what happened in the forests of Virginia made me sell all my gear and swear never to go into the woods alone again. It started with a decision that seemed right at the time. I'd already logged about 10 miles that day, and my legs were throbbing. According to the map, there was a shelter ahead, a 3-sided wooden lean-to for the night. But when I reached it, it was already noisy. A group of students were grilling sausages and laughing loudly. I was looking for solitude. That was the whole reason I'd gone hiking, to sort through my thoughts after a brutal divorce. A loud group was the last thing I needed. I checked the map again. The next water source was 5 miles away, and the sun was already sinking, painting the sky an uneasy gray. I decided to push on and camp off trail. It's not forbidden, but it's not recommended alone, especially during bear season. I tightened my pack straps and picked up the pace, leaving the students' voices behind. The forest grew denser. Here in Virginia, the trail often turns into what hikers call the green tunnel, a tight corridor of trees where visibility shrinks to 10 meters. An hour later, I ran into him. A man stood at the edge of the trail, leaning against an oak. He wasn't wearing a hiking pack. Just an old denim jacket, far too light for the chilly evening, and dirty work boots. His hands were buried in his pockets. As I passed, I nodded, the standard trail etiquette. "Evening," I said, not slowing down. He slowly turned his head. His face was blank, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. "Osprey pack, 70 liters, he said. His voice was dry, like snapping twigs. "Pretty heavy for one person, isn't it?" I stopped. It was a strange comment, but hikers often talk about gear. "I'm used to it," I replied shortly. "Have a good night." I took a step forward, wanting to break the distance. "Your left leg," he said to my back. "Still bothering you after the 2018 accident?" I froze as if I'd hit an invisible wall. Cold ran down my spine, instantly replacing the warmth from walking. I turned slowly. He was still leaning against the tree, hands in his pockets. "What did you say?" My voice wavered. In 2018, I'd been in a motorcycle crash. There was a pin in my ankle. I limped slightly by the end of the day, but only a doctor or someone very close could have noticed. He smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "Just the way you shift your weight," he said vaguely. "Take care of yourself, Artyom." He said my name. I hadn't introduced myself. There were no tags on my pack. I didn't ask questions. An ancient, animal instinct screamed, "Run." I turned and walked as fast as I could, risking a twisted ankle on the roots. I kept going until my lungs burned, stopping only when dusk turned the forest into a black and white film. That night I didn't light a fire. I pitched my tent deep in thick rhododendron bushes, 50 meters off the trail, and lay there with a knife in my hand, listening to every sound. But the forest was quiet. The next day, I convinced myself it was coincidence. Maybe he'd seen me at the parking lot at the trailhead while I was on the phone. Maybe he'd overheard my name. The rational mind is good at building comforting illusions. I hiked 20 miles that day. It was a punishing forced march. I wanted as much distance as possible between myself and that strange man. By midday on the third day, I'd calmed down. A man in a denim jacket with no gear couldn't possibly cover that distance so fast. I reached an exposed rocky outcrop known as Dragon's Tooth. The view was breathtaking, endless waves of mountains wrapped in mist. I was alone. I dropped my pack, pulled out my flask, and took a drink, enjoying the wind. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said to my left. I almost dropped the flask. On a nearby boulder, barely 10 meters away, sat him. The same man. The same light denim jacket, spotless, without a single smear of dirt or sweat. He sat casually, legs dangling over the abyss. It was impossible. Physically impossible. I'd been moving at a marathon pace. To get ahead of me, he would have had to run all night. Without a headlamp. Without food. How? I started, but the word died in my throat. You think too much about logic, he interrupted without looking at me. He was staring at the horizon. Anna always said you were too rational. That's why she left back then, before she got sick. Right? The world tilted. Anna was my first wife. She died of cancer. I hadn't spoken about her in years. I'd even taken off my ring. Who are you? I snarled, grabbing my pack. Fear turned into the aggression of a cornered animal. How do you know about Anna? Are you following me? He slowly turned his head. Now I could see his face clearly. It was ordinary. Terrifyingly ordinary. The kind of face you forget seconds after seeing it in a crowd. But his eyes were unnaturally still. He barely blinked. I'm just a fellow traveler, he said. Like you. We're all going somewhere to run from something. You're running from guilt. But guilt isn't something you can leave at a mile marker, Artyom. I didn't wait. I slung my pack over one shoulder and bolted down the trail, nearly tumbling over the rocks. I ran without looking, branches whipping my face, but I felt no pain. I needed people. A road. Civilization. The nearest shelter was 3 miles away. I prayed someone would be there. Anyone. When I reached the wooden lean-to, rain was starting. The sky had turned inky blue. The shelter was empty. Old ashes lay in a corner, but no one was around. I ran under the roof, dropped my pack, and frantically searched for the logbook. Every campsite has one, where hikers write their names and dates. I flipped through the pages with shaking hands, hoping to see someone had passed through that morning. The entries were ordinary: Hiker Joe, heading to Maine, sunny, great weather. Then I saw it. An entry dated today. The handwriting was neat, sharp, pressed hard into the page. October 14th. 6 p.m. Artyom will arrive here in 20 minutes. He'll be scared. He'll think he got away. But he forgot that I know the shortcuts. P.S. The blue jacket doesn't suit you. The one you wore at the funeral fit better. I flung the notebook away as if it were red hot. I looked down at my bright blue windbreaker. I'd bought it specifically for this hike. He'd been here. He'd been here before me. Or he was here right now. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the forest. The rain intensified, turning into a solid wall of water. The beam caught only wet tree trunks, like prison bars. Come out. I shouted, my voice breaking. I'm armed. Silence. Only rain drumming on the roof. I realized I couldn't stay in the shelter. It was open on one side. I'd be completely exposed. I needed my tent. I ran about 100 meters into the woods, into dense brush, trying not to snap branches. I pitched the tent in total darkness, by touch, without turning on the light. I crawled inside, zipped it shut, and pulled out my hunting knife. I sat hugging my knees and listened. An hour passed in silence. The rain eased, replaced by a thick fog that muffled every sound. I was slipping into a heavy doze when I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Animals move cautiously or quickly. These were heavy, confident steps of a biped. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. They weren't coming from the trail. They came straight out of the brush. Straight toward my hiding place. I stopped breathing. The steps halted right beside my tent. I saw a shadow fall across the fabric in the weak moonlight filtering through the clouds. A human silhouette. It stood motionless. Artyom, the voice said softly but clearly. The same voice. You forgot to close the logbook at the shelter. The pages will get wet. I gripped the knife handle until my knuckles turned white. Go away, I croaked. I have a gun. He laughed. A quiet, dry chuckle. No, you don't. You hate guns. Ever since your father shot himself. Tears of terror and helplessness streamed down my face. He knew everything. Every detail of my miserable life. Every trauma. Every scar. And then that sound came. Zzz. The tent zipper began to crawl downward. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the nightmare. A hand slipped through the opening. Pale, with long, filthy fingers. But that wasn't the worst part. On the ring finger was a ring. My wedding ring. The one I'd taken off and locked in a safe at home, hundreds of miles away. I brought you something, he whispered. At that moment, self-preservation finally overpowered fear. I didn't wait for him to open the entrance fully. With a wild scream, I stabbed through the tent wall on the opposite side. The nylon tore with a crack. I tumbled out into the wet mud and scrambled to my feet. I didn't look back. I heard a surprised gasp behind me, then heavy pounding. I ran through the night forest without direction. Branches tore my face bloody. I fell, got up, and ran again. I lost my flashlight, lost my bearings, but kept moving until I saw headlights in the distance. I stumbled onto the asphalt of a back road right in front of an old pickup truck. The driver nearly swerved into the ditch. Sitting in the cab, shaking, wrapped in a blanket, the driver, an elderly local, asked who I was running from. There was a man, I stammered. He followed me for 3 days. He knew everything about me. The old man frowned. Son, there hasn't been anyone on that section of the trail for a week. Bridges washed out down south. Rangers closed the access. You were there alone. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to blame it all on hallucinations from stress or exhaustion. But when I got home, the first thing I did was go to the safe. It was locked. Only I knew the code. I opened it with trembling fingers. The box where my wedding ring should have been was empty. And at the bottom of the safe lay a sheet of paper torn from the registration logbook of that shelter. There was only one question on it, written in the same sharp handwriting. Now we're even. I moved. Changed my name. I live in a big city where it's never dark or quiet. But sometimes, in a crowd, I smell old tobacco and rotting leaves. And I know he's somewhere nearby. Waiting for me to be alone again. I pressed my ear against the damp, moss-covered tree, trying not to breathe. Between my face and the black, foul-smelling sludge below there were barely 2 inches of rotting planks. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the vibration was traveling through the decking. I prayed it was the wind. Or settling mud. Then the sound came again. Directly beneath me. Not a dull splash. Not the scuttle of a rat. It was a sharp, wet inhale. Something enormous drew air through its nostrils while submerged in icy mud, in total darkness, right under where I was lying. And it knew I was there. People like to say the Appalachian Trail is safe if you follow the rules. They're lying. What happened to Mark and me that Tuesday in November never made it into the Rangers' official reports. But to this day, I can't sleep in houses with wooden floors. Every creak takes me back to that night. Welcome. This is my story. Mark and I had planned that hike for 6 months. A section of the Appalachian Trail in Vermont, late fall. The forest had already shed its leaves, turning into an endless gray palisade you could see straight through. They call this time of year, stick season. Almost no hikers. Empty shelters. A silence so complete it starts ringing in your ears. On the third day we entered a lowland. The map warned of wetlands, but we hadn't expected the water to be that high. The trail turned into an endless chain of wooden boardwalks, 2 narrow planks laid directly over the mud. Locals call them puncheons. Miles of slick wood suspended above black swamp. By 4 in the afternoon, leaden clouds rolled in. The light drained fast, as if someone were twisting a dimmer switch. We were supposed to reach a shelter on higher ground, but Mark twisted his ankle. Nothing serious, just a sprain, but our pace was shot. "We need to make camp," he said, wincing and leaning on his trekking pole. "I won't make it in the dark. One more slip and I'll snap my ankle." I looked around. Nothing but swamp. Dead tree trunks jutted from the black water, coated in pale lichen. There was no dry ground anywhere. The only solid surface was the boardwalk itself. About 500 meters ahead we found a wider section, an old wooden platform, probably built so 2 groups of hikers could pass each other. Roughly 10 by 10 feet, raised about 1.5 feet above the swamp. "We can't pitch a tent here," I said, an unexplainable unease tightening my chest. "It's against the rules. And it's too exposed." "Artyom, look around," Mark snapped. "It's either here or sleeping waist-deep in mud. Rangers aren't coming out here at night." That was the first choice. The moment when logic gives way to exhaustion, and you quietly sign your own sentence. We pitched the tent directly on the boards. There was nowhere to drive stakes, so we rigged the fly by tying guy lines to the edges of the platform and weighing them down with our packs. When night fell, the swamp came alive. But not like a normal forest. There were no crickets. No owls. The sounds were viscous. Slurping. Gurgling gas escaping the mud. Soft splashes, as if someone were tossing stones into the water. We heated dinner on the stove. The hiss of gas cut through the silence, and that was oddly comforting. "Hey, remember that ranger at the trailhead?" Mark asked, chewing his freeze-dried pasta. "The one who asked about our route?" "Yeah. He said something weird. Watch your footwear." I thought he meant keeping our feet dry. Then he added, "They like leather." "Who's they?" I smirked, though a chill crawled up my spine. "Raccoons? Probably. Or porcupines. They chew anything salty from sweat." We laughed, but it sounded forced. I shut off the stove. Darkness snapped shut around our little island of light. The headlamp beam revealed only rotting boards stretching into nowhere, and black water beneath them. We sealed the food in a dry bag and hung it from a dead tree branch a few feet from the platform, like you're supposed to keep bears away. Our packs stayed in the tent vestibule. I couldn't sleep. The hard boards pressed through my pad, and the smell of the swamp seeped through the tent fabric, sulfur, rotting leaves, and something else, musky, like a wet dog. Around 2 a.m., I woke with a jolt. The entire platform shuddered. Not wind. Someone had stepped onto the boards. I froze, listening. Mark slept beside me, breathing evenly. I stared at the tent ceiling, waiting. Creak. A slow, drawn-out groan of bending wood. As if something very heavy had carefully shifted its weight from one leg to the other. The sound didn't come from the trail leading in. It came from the very edge of our platform. Bear, I thought. Curious animals. It could have climbed up. I slowly reached for the bear spray tucked inside my sleeping bag. My hand was shaking. The creak came again, closer to the tent. And that's when I realized something was wrong. Bears walk heavy. Claws click on wood. This sound was soft. As if someone barefoot, or wearing something flexible, was testing each board before stepping down. Something rustled in the vestibule. The sound of a zipper. Someone was opening the zipper on my backpack, millimeter by millimeter, outside under the vestibule fly. Animals don't unzip bags. Raccoons rip fabric. Bears tear everything apart. But this sound was deliberate. Zip, pause. Zip, pause. I jabbed Mark with my elbow. He inhaled sharply, about to speak, but I clamped a hand over his mouth. Quiet, I whispered into his ear. Someone's out there. Mark's eyes went wide in the dark. We lay perfectly still. The rustling stopped. Absolute silence followed, so thick it felt like the world had hit pause. A minute. 2. 5. Maybe you imagined it? Mark breathed. And then my backpack was yanked. Not tugged. Ripped violently out from under the vestibule. The tent lurched, and the stake hooked over the edge of the board snapped loose with a clang. I screamed, flicked on my headlamp, unzipped the inner tent, and lunged outside with the spray in hand. Get back! I shouted, sweeping the beam through the darkness. Nothing. The platform was empty. The light bounced off wet boards vanishing into fog. My backpack was gone. Where is it? Mark crawled out behind me, gripping a folding knife. It's gone, I said, stunned. Someone just stole my pack. People? Out here? At 3 a.m? We shone our lights into the water around the platform. Black, oily stillness. No ripples. No bubbles. Look, Mark said, pointing at the edge. Where my pack had been moments before, a mark stained the wet wood. Not a boot print. A smeared imprint of a bare foot. But wrong. Too long. The toes stretched unnaturally, pianist long, yet wide and flat. Then we heard it. A splash. Soft. Careful. Directly beneath us. The blood drained from my face. We were standing on a wooden island in the middle of a swamp, and whatever stole my pack hadn't gone into the forest. It went down. Under the boards. We're leaving, I said. My voice shook. Now. Abandon the tent. Grab your gear and go. You're insane. Walk the puncheons in the dark? Mark, it's under us. As if in answer, a knock came from below. Someone rapped their knuckles against the board by my feet. Tap. 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 We jumped to the center of the platform, backs pressed together. Who's there? Mark screamed, his voice breaking. We're armed. Silence. Then a sound I will never forget. A low vibration, like purring mixed with water bubbling in a throat. It came from multiple points at once. As if beneath the platform, in that cramped half-meter of mud and water, there wasn't one creature. There were many. The gaps, I whispered. Shine the light through the gaps. The boards had narrow seams between them, barely half an inch wide. Mark angled the beam straight down. At first there was only black water and gray sludge. Then something moved in the light. A face. Floating in the muck, face up, directly beneath the gap. The skin was pale gray, like dead fish flesh. The eyes had rolled back so only bloodshot whites showed. The mouth hung open, revealing black, rotten teeth. And it was smiling. Mark screamed and staggered back, nearly falling off the platform. Jesus Christ! There's a body down there. It blinked, Mark. Corpses don't blink. Suddenly fingers shot up through a gap by my boot. Filthy fingers with long, broken yellow nails. They clamped onto my sole with iron strength. I yanked my leg back, falling onto my back. The thing below snarled, a wet, furious sound. I kicked at the fingers with my other foot, felt something crunch, and the grip loosened. Run! I screamed. We left everything. The tent. The sleeping bags. My stolen pack. We bolted down the narrow boardwalk the way we'd come. Running on two slick planks in the dark is suicide. My headlamp beam jumped wildly, slicing through fog. Behind me I heard Mark's pounding steps and ragged breathing. And other sounds. On both sides of the boardwalk, something moved alongside us in the swamp. Splashes. Wet slurps. They weren't on the boards. They were running through the mire, impossibly fast. "Don't stop!" I yelled. Ahead, the boardwalk dipped where one section had sunk a few inches under water. I leapt the puddle. Behind me, Mark screamed. "Short! Cut off!" I skidded to a halt and spun around, barely keeping my balance. "Mark!" The beam pierced the darkness. He was 10 meters back, sprawled on the boards. He hadn't slipped. His hands clawed at the edges of the planks. His legs were dangling in the water. Something was pulling him down. "Artyom," he howled. "It's pulling me. Help me." I ran to him. His body jerked inch by inch toward the black sludge. His nails scraped the wet wood, leaving pale streaks. I grabbed the straps of the pack he'd managed to throw on. "I've got you." I braced my feet and pulled. But the force below was monstrous. This wasn't one creature. It felt like the swamp itself had decided to claim him. Mark looked up at me. In the headlamp glow, I saw complete understanding in his eyes. "They're under the boards," he whispered. "There are hundreds." Then his pack ripped. The strap tore loose. I flew backward, slamming into a tree. Mark vanished. No prolonged struggle. Just a violent yank, a splash, and silence. I crawled to the edge. The water was calm. A few large bubbles rose and burst, releasing the stench of rot. "Mark?" My voice was a whimper. From the spot where my friend disappeared, my boot slowly floated up. The same one they'd grabbed earlier. Then Mark's trekking pole surfaced beside it. And then I heard it again. Breathing. Not from the water. From beneath the boards I was standing on. Directly under me. A slow, rasping inhale. It was there. Waiting for me to stand. I don't remember how I escaped. I think I crawled. I cried. I screamed for my mother like a child. I crawled for miles until wood gave way to solid, rocky ground. I ran until dawn, until I reached a highway. The truck driver who picked me up said I looked like I'd clawed my way out of a grave. Police and rangers searched the swamp. They found our tent, shredded as if a pack of rabid dogs had torn it apart. My backpack was recovered 100 meters from camp, sunk deep in the mud. They never found Mark. The official conclusion was a bear attack. They said the body could have been pulled into the swamp. Said he might have panicked and drowned. But when the investigator returned my belongings, he handed me my boot. The one that floated. "Strange thing," he said quietly, glancing around. "There are bite marks on the rubber. But, they aren't animal teeth. Bears have fangs. These marks look like something chewed the sole with flat, human teeth." I took my things and left. I don't hike anymore. But sometimes, when I walk along a boardwalk or stand on a wooden deck, I freeze. I hear someone holding their breath beneath the planks. And I know that if I look through the gap between the boards, I'll see that pale, unblinking eye again. They didn't stay in that swamp. They're wherever there's darkness beneath your feet. Good night. And watch where you step. I was kneeling in the snow, the cold seeping through the fabric of my pants, yet I barely felt it. All my attention was fixed on what lay before me. It was a footprint. A bare human footprint. Long and narrow, with toes unnaturally splayed. It was sharp and deep, as if it had been left only seconds ago. But the most horrifying part wasn't that someone had been walking barefoot in 20-degree frost. The most horrifying part was where those footprints were going. I lifted my head and looked ahead, toward the place where the trail dipped into a dense stand of spruce. The footprints led there as well. They followed exactly the route I had mapped out 5 minutes earlier. They curved around a fallen tree at the precise spot where I had planned to pass it. They paused exactly where I had intended to take a break. I was staring at the tracks of my own future, left behind by someone else. By someone who knew every step I was going to take before I took it. And then, in the dead silence of the winter forest, I heard a branch crack. Not behind me. Ahead of me. There, where the footprints ended, and where I was supposed to be. This is not an urban legend. This is the reason I sold all my gear and never go outside after sunset again. Do not turn around. Everything began with a desire for silence. Trite, I know. We all seek silence when the city starts pressing on our temples with its endless hum. I'm an experienced hiker. I've been going on solo trips for about 10 years. The Appalachian Trail was like a backyard to me. I knew the rules. I knew the risks. I respected the forest. Or at least, I thought I did. It was late November, the most treacherous time of year, when autumn has already died, but winter hasn't fully claimed its territory yet. The forecast promised clear skies and a light frost, perfect conditions to cover 20 kilometers, set up camp, and finally breathe out the stress that had piled up. I left my car in a gravel parking lot at the trailhead. Not a soul around. Just a low, gray sky and bare trees like skeletons stretching their arms upward. The air was dry and sharp, smelling of decaying leaves and approaching snow, even though the meteorologists swore there would be no precipitation. The first few hours went perfectly. The backpack pressed familiarly on my shoulders, and the rhythm of my steps was calming. But around 4 in the afternoon, the light began to change. In the mountains, dusk doesn't arrive gradually, it drops on you like a heavy blanket. The forest lost its colors, turning into a black and white engraving. And with the darkness came the silence. This wasn't the peaceful silence yogis chase. It was a vacuum, dense and oppressive. Birds fell silent all at once. The wind died. Even my own footsteps on the frozen ground sounded deafening, as if I were violating some ancient taboo. I decided to make camp earlier than planned. I found a small clearing surrounded by a tight ring of old spruce trees. The place felt sheltered, almost cozy. I quickly pitched my one-man tent, spread out my sleeping bag, and started preparing dinner on my stove. As the water heated, I noticed the temperature dropping sharply. Thick clouds of vapor poured from my mouth. I looked up at the sky. There were no stars. Heavy, leaden clouds covered everything, and in the beam of my headlamp I saw the first snowflake. It drifted down onto my jacket sleeve and didn't melt. 10 minutes later, the snowfall began. Not a light, romantic flurry, but a dense wall of white noise. Large flakes fell straight down without the slightest breath of wind. The forest vanished. All that remained was the small illuminated circle of my camp and the endless darkness beyond it. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and felt safe. The thin nylon created an illusion of protection. I ate, read a book on my phone, and around 9 in the evening I turned off the light. Sleep came quickly, lulled by the soft hiss of snow hitting the tent. I don't know how long I slept. An hour? 3? I woke up with a jolt, as if shocked by electricity. My heart was pounding in my throat. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, and listened. The snowfall had stopped. The forest stood in absolute, ringing silence. But it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling. A sticky, primal sensation that I was not alone. And then I heard it. Crunch. A slow, measured sound of snow being compressed. Creak. Pause. Creak. Pause. The sound came from outside, about 5 meters from the tent. My mind frantically searched for a rational explanation. A deer? A bear? But the rhythm was wrong. Bipedal. The footsteps were approaching. Slowly, unhurriedly. I reached into my backpack pocket, found my folding knife, and gripped the handle until my knuckles turned white. A 10-centimeter blade against whatever was roaming out there in the dark was laughable, but it was all I had. The steps stopped right by my head. I lay in my sleeping bag, separated from whoever stood outside by only millimeters of thin fabric. I heard breathing. Not an animal's snort, not a growl. A strange, wet intake of air. As if someone were tasting my scent. As if a face had pressed against the outer wall of the tent, trying to catch the warmth of my body. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to every god I didn't believe in for it to go away. And it did. But not away. It began to circle the tent. Creak. 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 It walked around me. Slowly. Methodically. I turned my head, following the sound. One circle. A second. A third. It didn't try to get inside. It didn't touch the guy lines. It didn't brush the fabric. It simply walked around me, locking me inside an endless loop of terror. This went on for hours. I couldn't check the time, afraid the glow of my screen would give me away, though whoever was outside clearly already knew I was awake. My hand went numb from gripping the knife. The cold cut to the bone, yet I was slick with sweat. At some point, the rhythm of the footsteps became hypnotic. I started to lose my grip on reality. It felt as if the tent were floating in a black void, and that sound was the only thing holding the world together. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The steps froze somewhere near the entrance of the tent. I waited. 1 minute. 10. Half an hour. Silence returned, but now it was heavy, saturated with presence. I didn't sleep until dawn. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the gray nylon as it gradually grew lighter. When the sun finally began to filter through the branches, giving enough light to see without a headlamp, I made a decision. Slowly, inch by inch, I unzipped the tent. The sound of the zipper felt like a cannon blast. I peered outside. No one. The forest was buried under pristine, untouched snow. About 15 centimeters of fresh powder covered everything. The world was blindingly white and calm. I exhaled, feeling the tension loosen its grip. Maybe I'd dreamed it. Maybe it was the wind dumping snow from the branches. Isolation can play cruel tricks on the mind. I crawled out of the tent to stretch my stiff legs and relieve myself. The cold air burned my lungs, clearing my head. I walked around the tent to check the stakes, and froze. Around my shelter, forming a perfect circle with a radius of about 1.5 meters, were footprints. They couldn't have been made by the wind. They couldn't have been made by an animal. They were barefoot human footprints. I dropped to my knees, staring at them. They were sharp, deeply pressed into the snow. About a size 45. Long, narrow feet. Toes unnaturally long and spread, like a pianist's fingers transplanted onto feet. Skin should have left texture, but the prints were smooth, almost waxy. There were many of them. Dozens of circles, trampled one over another, turning the snow into an icy trench. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that there were no tracks leading to the circle. And none leading away from it. The footprints had simply appeared around the tent and ended there. As if something had descended from the sky, walked around me all night, and then evaporated. Panic, cold and razor-sharp, slammed into my skull. I had to leave. Now. To hell with breakfast. To hell with packing neatly. I began frantically stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack. My hands were shaking, my fingers wouldn't cooperate. I rolled up the tent haphazardly and strapped it to the outside of my pack. Every second of delay felt like an eternity. It seemed to me that someone was standing behind the trees. That hundreds of eyes were watching my panic. I hoisted the backpack and checked my compass. The car was southeast, 10 kilometers away. I knew the trail, but under the snow it was barely visible. I just had to head downhill until I reached the creek, and from there to the parking lot. I took my first step away from the cursed clearing, away from the circle of prints. The snow crunched pleasantly under my boots. I walked fast, almost ran, forcing myself not to look back. 200 meters later, I stopped. Right in front of me, on the untouched white surface, stretched a line of footprints. The same ones. Bare. They went in the same direction I was going. My stomach twisted into a knot. Maybe it was another hiker? Some lunatic practicing cold exposure? I stepped closer. The prints were fresh. The edges hadn't collapsed yet. But something about them was wrong. The spacing. The angle of the feet. I placed my foot next to one of the prints. A perfect match in stride length. I took another step. The print ahead had taken a step too. I looked ahead. The trail of prints wound between the trees. I knew this route. I had traced it in my mind while studying the map. Here, you skirt the ravine. The prints skirted the ravine. Here, it's best to pass between two boulders. The prints passed exactly there. They were my tracks. But I hadn't left them yet. Someone had walked my route, at my pace, with my stride length, barefoot. And had done it only minutes earlier. Calm down, I said out loud. My voice sounded thin and pathetic. It's a coincidence. Just keep going to the car. I moved forward, trying not to step into the prints. It was impossible. The trail was narrow. Every time I put my foot down, I felt it sink into already compacted snow. I was walking in lockstep with a ghost. The fear turned into sheer terror when I noticed the footprints beginning to change. At first it was subtle. But after a kilometer, I understood, whoever was ahead had started to stumble. The right footprint smeared, as if the walker had twisted an ankle. 5 meters later, a deep groove in the snow, as if they'd dropped to one knee. I stopped, breathing hard. Why had they fallen? The ground was even. There were no roots under the snow. I took a step, and my foot plunged into a hidden gap between rocks. Pain shot through my ankle. I cried out and dropped to one knee, clawing at the snow. I froze on all fours. Pain throbbed in my leg, but my mind was elsewhere. I looked at the print in front of me. A deep groove from a knee. Exactly like the one I had just made. It wasn't just walking my route. It was playing out a script. It knew where I would fall. It knew where it would hurt. I lifted my head. The footprints continued ahead. And now they had changed again. The stride was uneven, favoring the right leg. I stood up, grimacing in pain. Tested my foot. It hurt, but I could walk. I limped. I looked at the prints ahead. They limped. A trapped animal's rage surged through me. I would not play this game. I would not go where those damn footprints led. I veered sharply left into the dense undergrowth. Straight through bushes and drifts, off the trail. I forced my way through thorny branches, scratching my face, ignoring the pain in my leg. I was gasping for air, steam pouring off me like a locomotive. I pushed about 50 meters through untouched snow, leaving behind a deep, uneven trench. I emerged into a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath. My heart hammered in my ears. I looked down. Clean snow. Thank God. I'd escaped. I'd broken the script. I lifted my eyes. At the far end of the clearing, about 20 meters away, stood a birch tree. Lone, white, twisted. And beneath it were barefoot footprints. They hadn't come from anywhere. They simply began there. 2 prints side by side, toes pointed toward me. And they were fresh. The snow inside them was still settling. But no one was there. I blinked. And for a fraction of a second, it seemed as if the air above the prints shimmered. Like heat haze over summer asphalt. Except it was -10. Then I saw a new footprint appear in the snow. Right before my eyes. An invisible weight pressed into the white powder, compressing it, forming a heel, an arch, long toes. Crunch. A print appeared a meter from the previous one, closer to me. Crunch. Another print. Even closer. It was coming toward me. It was invisible, but it was here. And it was running. The distance between the prints increased. Snow sprayed up in little fountains. It was accelerating. I screamed. Not a human scream, an animal shriek. I dropped my backpack. Dropped everything. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I ran. I don't remember the pain in my leg. I remember only the blur of trees, branches whipping my face, and that sound behind me. The rapid, heavy thudding of bare feet pounding snow. It didn't fall behind. But it didn't catch up either. It stayed 5 meters back, hurting me like prey. I burst into the parking lot, nearly crashing into the information board. My car stood there, dusted with a thin layer of snow, the only splash of color in that black and white hell. With shaking hands, I yanked out my keys, dropped them into a snowbank, fell to my knees, clawing through the snow, whimpering in terror. Found them. Opened the door. Fell inside and slammed the locks. I started the engine. The heater roared, blasting icy air. I looked in the rearview mirror. The forest stood like a wall. Silent. Motionless. At the edge of the trees, where I had burst out, the line of footprints ended. The last print sat right at the edge of the asphalt. I put the car in gear and hit the gas without warming the engine. The car skidded, but I corrected and tore down the winding road, away from the mountains, away from the snow. I drove for 3 hours without stopping until I reached the first major city. Only there, at a gas station surrounded by people and artificial light, did I allow myself to cry. I don't hike anymore. I sold my tent, my sleeping bag, even my boots. I live in the center of a megacity, on the 10th floor. It's never quiet here. There is always light. But sometimes, when the first snow falls, I wake up at night. I think I hear a crunch. I go to the window and look down at the snow-covered street. And I'm terrified. Terrified of seeing, there on the sidewalk, a lonely line of bare footprints repeating my route to work tomorrow. Footprints that are waiting for me to take the next step.